Evelyn had packed more than clothes into her suitcase. She had folded decades, linen soft letters tied with ribbon, a threadbare copy of The Great Gatsby with Harold's pencil marks in the margins, a silver locket that still smelled faintly of his aftershave, into the corners between her sweaters. At 72, she had become an expert at folding memories into neat, manageable bundles, the way one folds a scarf to hide a tear. The Maldives felt like a place big enough to hold what she could no longer carry on her own. The plane's descent was quiet. Below, the ocean was a plate of blown turquoise glass, set with specks of white and green like a painter's deliberate mistakes. Evelyn pressed her fingertips to the window as if she could smooth the sky, and thought about the letter she'd written to herself the month after Harold died. Go once for both of us. Don't make my last map only to his address. She had promised. Now, she would keep that promise. The resort was all soft wood and laughter. Palm fronds brushed the paths like familiar greetings. Guests moved through the spaces in pairs and small, sun-bronzed families. Evelyn noticed them the way people notice clouds, present, shifting, but not hers. The staff greeted her with a warmth that felt, at first, theatrical, and then somehow genuine. A young woman named Aisha led her across a narrow bridge and through a door into her overwater villa. It smelled of coconut and driftwood. Her villa's veranda opened onto a lagoon so bright her eyes watered. She let herself sit and listen to the sound. The bell slap of waves against stilts, the soft creak of a far-off deck chair. She had expected the ocean to feel like a stranger, but instead it felt like a conversation partner. Steady, rhythmic, patient. She unfolded the letter she had written at home and read it aloud to the water, her voice small enough to keep from startling herself. Dear Evelyn, she read, the tremor in her voice folding into a smile. Do not apologize for wanting to be happy. Love the sun. Eat the mangoes. Dance if you feel like it. We are still allowed to surprise ourselves. On the neighboring veranda, a shadow moved. A man glanced over, then waved with the sort of easy apologetic smile that makes strangers feel like old acquaintances. He was younger than Evelyn expected, 35 maybe, sun-creased but not tired, with hair that had not yet gone fully to silver. He carried a camera strap over his shoulder, and wore a faded baseball cap that made him look like someone who had both learned and still wanted to learn. Hi, he said, stepping closer. Sorry if I startled you. I'm Daniel. The room next door. Just moved in. Evelyn regarded him with the cool appraisal of someone who had lived through fashions twice. Evelyn, she replied. Welcome. Isn't the water something? He grinned. It's ridiculous. He pulled up a chair and sat as if conversation were the most natural thing in the world. You from here? He asked, taking in her luggage, her book, the way she still held the folded letter in her hand. No, she said. From Massachusetts. A little town where the summer hangs on like gum and hair. They talked like people who had forgotten how to be strangers. Daniel told her that he wrote travel articles and took photographs, that his mother still lived in their hometown, and had insisted he come see the world before he settled down. Evelyn told him about Harold, without making him a shadow in every sentence. She spoke of how Harold had loved maps, how he had folded edges and labeled routes in his precise hand. How, for their 50th wedding anniversary, he had given her a compass that still ticked when she wound it. You carry him with you, Daniel said, not as a question. He had the humility of someone who understood the awkwardness of naming grief. Evelyn surprised herself by laughing. I carry him in my luggage, she corrected. He takes up half the space. The laugh sounded lighter than she felt, and Daniel's face softened. He began to appear at meals and shore walks. The resort was small enough that an old woman and a young man could orbit one another without people asking questions. They shared meals under thatched roofs and swapped stories, while hermit crabs skittered like small conspirators at their feet. Daniel liked to talk about the shapes of islands, and how every place kept its own kind of silence. Evelyn liked to listen, because listening was the thing she had done best for Harold. There were moments that felt, inexplicably, like permission. One late afternoon, they sat on the wooden steps that led to the sea, and watched the sun set in a stripe of molten gold. A local musician was playing a slow song nearby, a tune Evelyn recognized even without the words, an old Sinatra standard they danced to once, in a basement kitchen toasted with smoke and optimism. "Do you dance?" Daniel asked, as if he'd just asked the better question of the day. Evelyn looked at her feet in their sandals. She pictured herself in that kitchen, Harold's arms a steady anchor, his breath warm at her ear. "I danced once," she said, "and I haven't since." "Then dance again," he said, and there was nothing presumptuous in his voice, only a gentle urging, like reminding a friend they'd forgotten their umbrella. They stood. He extended his hand, not because he wanted anything, but because he liked to offer good things plainly, and she placed her palm in his. The boards under their feet were warm from sun and salt. He led with a careful confidence, his hand steady as if he'd always known that the best way to ask permission is to make the asking a kindness. They moved slowly, awkwardly at first, and then with more ease. There were no bright lights or applause, only the swell of the sea, and the low hum of the musician. When the song reached its quiet end, Evelyn felt a trickle of something that was not quite giddiness and not sorrow either, but a soft, improbable possibility. She laughed, a sound that started at her chest and spilled like lemonade. That evening, as the stars blinked to life above them, impossibly bright in a place far from the glare of city lights, Daniel told her about his father. "He left when I was young," Daniel said. "Not a dramatic departure, nothing torn in half, just one day he packed and didn't return. My mother told me then that sometimes people are like boats. They go where the tide wants them. You can't be angry with the sea." Evelyn thought of the small cruelties of time. How it took people gently, like the tide, how sometimes someone you had loved until the marrow disappeared because their map had reached another location. She spoke softly of marriage and the quiet expansions and contractions of two lives folded together. Daniel listened, asking the right kinds of questions, the ones that held space rather than tried to fill it. They began to share a ritual. Each morning he would find her on her veranda, coffee steaming, reading Harold's marginalia as though they were new letters. Each evening they would walk the narrow beaten sand path that wound through the resort's gardens, backlit by lanterns, speaking of small survivals. The taste of a mango that made one recall the very first summer at 16, the kid who stole their bike, the neighbor who still mowed the lawn wrong. On the fourth day, the resort announced a local night, a celebration of music and dance where guests were invited to join in under strings of lights. Evelyn watched the preparation with an amused detachment. She had learned after losing Harold that novelty could be a trap if you weren't careful. Too bright, too quickly, and you could be swept along before you knew whether you wanted the ride. Yet when Daniel approached her that night with a lei and a conspiratorial grin, she felt something like courage. "Come," he said. "Come and make a fool of yourself with me." Evelyn told him no. He respected it, but he did not let go. Instead he coaxed her into the square where the islanders danced. He introduced her to a woman named May who taught Evelyn a step that required patience and a small leap. May put a hand on Evelyn's back like an anchor and said, "Age is only the number of times you take the leap." Evelyn laughed until the sound made people turn. She found herself dancing with a man in a faded captain's shirt who told a terrible joke about sea cucumbers, and then raised his glass to her, as though she had done something brave without realizing it. When the evening unfurled into a night of starbathing and slow songs, Daniel and Evelyn lingered near the shore, their toes buried in cool sand. "You're someone who listens to other people's music," Daniel observed, turning the phrase over like a favorite coin. "Not just the radio, but the meaning behind the lyrics, the lives that made them happen." Evelyn thought of Harold humming a song while mowing the lawn in the summer. "And you?" she asked. "What music do you listen to when you're alone?" He smiled, and in the brief tilt of his mouth she could see how he used humor like a bridge. "Depends on the day. Sometimes it's rock to remember that I'm still wearing skin. Sometimes it's Nat King Cole when I want the world to feel ordered. And sometimes it's nothing, just the hum of the camera in my hands." They lay back on a towel and watched the sky, letting the night talk to them. The sea breathed like someone asleep, and the resort's lights dimmed to match. It was easy to imagine that the world had paused to let them finish this small catalogue of themselves. The fifth day choreographed itself into a quiet morning. Daniel knocked and offered coffee, and 2 croissants with chocolate tucked like a secret. "There's a reef walk today," he said. "A guided thing. The guide says they saw a manta yesterday." "Wanna go?" Evelyn hesitated. She loved the sea, but had always loved it from shore. Things that lived beneath the glass surface felt like memories you might drown in if you weren't careful. Yet the idea of missing something because of some carefully constructed fear felt worse. "I'll try," she said. "But I'll need you to be patient. Very patient." He promised, and his promise unfurled into a day of small marvels. They walked along shallow plates of coral, their legs splashing in water the color of upside-down leaves. Fish blinked like living buttons, and Evelyn laughed at their arrogance. So colorful, so unapologetic. Daniel showed her how the light telegraphed movement beneath the water, how a swirl of silver suggested a school, and how to watch for the gentle flight of a manta. They drifted farther out, buoyed by vests and the novelty of it all. Evelyn's breath came in shallow, delighted gasps as a manta glided beneath them, a ghost of a creature leaving only a ripple as proof it had been there. When they bobbed back toward the surface, Evelyn felt like someone who had dipped a toe into a pool and found the water warm. On the boat ride home, the guide, bare-chested, smile wide as a reef, pointed to a distant island. "There's an old lighthouse," he said, and his voice carried the island's affinity for myth. "People used to bring letters there, letters to the sea. It said couples tied messages to the rail and hoped the ocean would carry them where they could no longer travel." Evelyn pictured her own letter, already written and held like a fragile bird. She imagined Harold's handwriting on the back of a postcard, but Harold's voice came to her instead. "Go, Evelyn. Don't wait for me to find the map." The command she had once pronounced gently to herself felt like a pulse now, insistent, kind. That night, back on her veranda, Daniel produced his camera and, as if on impulse, began to flip through the photos. He leaned back in his chair, his face soft in the lantern light, and showed her the world as he had seen it. A fisherman unlacing his boat, a child with ice cream smeared across his cheek, a woman in a headscarf bargaining at the market. He had an eye for ordinary miracles. "You keep me honest," he said. "When I get too big about myself, your stories remind me people are the story." Evelyn turned a page in Harold's book. There, in the margin beside a sentence about longing, Harold had written, in his precise, economical hand, "Always leave room for surprise." She looked up at Daniel, and felt the edges of something that had been asleep begin to stir. It wasn't the dramatic rekindling one sees in movies. No sudden trumpet fanfare, no diagnosable epiphany. It was more of a small hinge opening. 2 nights later, a storm rolled in from a horizon far away. The resort staff took precautions. Tropical weather could be quick and stubborn. Guests settled into their villas with board games and bottles of wine. The ocean rose in a restless mood, hammering the stilts and making small thunder where water met wood. Evelyn sat by the sliding glass door and watched the rain braid itself down the panes. There was a power outage that made the place feel ancient, like one had been transported to a house with candles, and the old practice of having to look at each other to make conversation. Daniel came by with a torch. "Battery's out," he said, holding up a small lantern. "Thought you might like light." They sat and talked like two people huddled in a tent. The island drummed its rain on the roof. Daniel told a story about sleeping in a tent in Patagonia, about waking to find a herd of llamas keeping curious watch. Evelyn told him about the time she and Harold got lost in the Berkshires for an afternoon, and found a dairy farm that sold ice cream by the cup with names like Maple Melancholy. "You could sell that," Daniel said, laughing. "Maple Melancholy, people would buy a cup just for the title." Evelyn felt a warmth that was not merely from the lantern. It felt like an inside joke that she had not known she was in on. The storm, which had been a curtain, now felt like a stage. The sea was loud and insistent. The guests in neighboring villas played cards and talked in low tones. It was, in its own way, the kind of night where untidy truths could step up to the microphone. When the lights flickered back on, people cheered like a small congregation. Outside, the sea's mood smoothed, like someone who had cried and decided to sleep. Daniel walked her to her room. At the door he hesitated. "Evelyn," he said, and there was something careful in the way he selected the name. "I don't want this to sound forward, but, thank you. For the company. For the stories. For walking with me." She found herself steadying the edge of the doorway with a hand she did not know belonged to her. "Thank you," she replied, "for the daring." He smiled, then surprised her by taking an envelope out of his pocket and handing it to her. It was small, the kind one might use to tuck a pressed flower into. "I don't usually do this," he said, cheeks flushing under the polite curtain of self-mockery. "But I keep taking pictures of things that remind me of a story I used to hear. My mother, she tells this one. When she was a girl, an old neighbor used to bring her postcards from the sea. The neighbor's name, well, she called her Evie." Evelyn blinked. "Evie," she repeated. It had been a childhood nickname, one Harold had used when they were young and foolish. She had not heard it in decades. Daniel shrugged. "Small world, or maybe it's a windy one. I thought you might like it." He handed her the envelope. Inside was a small photograph, a Polaroid of a lighthouse with a postcard taped to the back. On the postcard, in a handwriting that looked oddly familiar, were the words, "To Evie, from a man who knew she liked the sea." Evelyn turned the little picture over, heart striking like a bell. The handwriting was not Harold's, but it had the same steadiness, an odd echo she could almost trace like a tune. She had 1,000 questions, but the night suppressed all of them into a single bright curiosity. "Why would my mother remember that?" Daniel asked, perhaps answering a thought Evelyn had not spoken. Evelyn held the photograph to the lantern light. The lighthouse's paint had peeled in dignified strips. The postcard's edges were worn, as if it had crossed many hands. Her chest felt like it had found an unfamiliar rhythm, and was trying it on for size. "Maybe," she said slowly, "because sometimes the sea carries things we think are long gone. Or maybe because some people, like lighthouses, keep sending their light even when no one remembers asking for it." Daniel's face softened. "Then perhaps we both were waiting for a light," he said. They sat in the hush after the storm, two strangers who had found an unexpected harbor in each other's small, careful company. The night felt large and yet intimate, like an old book opened at a favorite page. Evelyn slid the photograph into her book between pages Harold had once annotated, and felt a little ripple of mischief. She had traveled to the Maldives for a promise. She had not expected the promise to fold back into something that looked suspiciously like beginning. It was not rectangular with dramatic arcs. It was a quiet, persistent insistence that life could still hold surprises. A wind came and drew a long breath across the water. Daniel stood to leave. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, as if the words had always been part of their arrangement. "Tomorrow," she repeated. He left, and Evelyn closed the door with the gentle care of someone who had just heard a particularly good piece of news and wanted to keep it safe. She sat with Harold's book open, and the Polaroid tucked between the pages. The postcard's little script seemed to wink at her like an ally. She had come here to say goodbye. To herself, to pasts that refused to let go. Instead she had found a neighbor, a song, a place where the sea seemed to be trying to get her attention. There was a sound at the threshold, paper sliding against wood. Evelyn looked up and saw, tucked beneath the doormat, a folded handbill from the resort staff. On it in neat print were the words, "Special announcement. Tomorrow at noon, a guided trip to the uninhabited island for letters to the sea and a reunion of sorts. Please sign up at the front desk." Beneath the printed words someone had scrawled in a different pen, the handwriting quick and almost embarrassed, "And bring the locket. Ask May about Evie's promise." Evelyn's name felt like it had been written across her, a gentle, impossible invitation. She stared at the scrawl until the letters blurred into each other, and in the small space between then and now, something shifted. There were too many coincidences for comfort, too many small matches of memory and handwriting to ignore. She did not know what Evie's promise was, or why someone had written it on a resort handbill. But she did know this. She had come to the ocean to find what the tide would bring, and the tide, it seemed, liked to answer back. Evelyn folded the handbill, slid it into her pocket, and lay awake until the dark felt like a messenger delivering possibilities. Somewhere between the pulse of the ocean and the slow blink of the ceiling lamp, she felt the story tilt. Tomorrow would be a day when old letters might meet a new pair of hands. Tomorrow she might find out why the sea had become so talkative. Outside, the waves kept their private counsel, and in their persistent, honest way they promised nothing and everything. Evelyn slept with the photograph pressed against her heart, and for the first time in a long time, she dreamed of a map she could not yet read. Morning arrived as softly as a secret. The storm had rinsed the island clean, even the palms seemed freshly pressed. Evelyn woke to the kind of silence that only comes after rain, a silence that wasn't empty but full, humming with all the small repairs the world makes overnight. She dressed slowly, as though she were trying not to scare away a thought, and placed the silver locket around her neck. It felt heavier than usual, as if it had decided to remember something she'd forgotten. Out on the veranda, Daniel was already there, coffee in one hand, his camera in the other. He looked different in morning light. Younger, maybe, or simply less certain of himself. The sun cast his shadow across the boards, reaching almost to her bare feet. "You're up early," she said, stepping outside. "I don't sleep well after storms." He smiled. "Everything feels like it's holding its breath." "You?" "Couldn't stay in bed. The ocean was whispering too loudly." He laughed. "Good reason. Want to walk before breakfast?" Evelyn nodded. They moved together along the boardwalk that linked the villas to the beach. The sea was a sheet of glass, the air thick with the scent of wet salt and hibiscus. The horizon was drawn clean and sharp, as if the night had polished it. They didn't talk for a while. Sometimes words are too small for mornings like that. Evelyn felt the rhythm of her steps match Daniel's, the sound of their sandals making a quiet duet. When they reached the sand, a group of staff were setting up tables and colorful banners. Evelyn recognized May among them, the woman who'd taught her to dance. May spotted her, waved, and came running over. "Good morning, Miss Evelyn. You saw the handbill?" Evelyn smiled cautiously. "I did. Though I confess, I don't quite understand what Evie's promise means." May's grin softened. "Ah, that. It's an island story, half legend, half truth, maybe both. Long time ago, a woman from far away came here. She was older, traveling alone, and she carried a box of letters. Locals called her Evie, because her real name was hard to pronounce. Every year, she came to this island to drop one letter into the sea for someone she'd loved but lost. Before she died, she told the lighthouse keeper to keep her secret safe, that the ocean would return her letters when the time was right." Daniel glanced at Evelyn, eyebrows raised. "That's oddly specific." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "It's just a coincidence." May shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's how the sea remembers names." She handed Evelyn a small conch shell tied with a piece of ribbon. "For the trip today. You'll need it." "What for?" Evelyn asked. May winked. "You'll see." After breakfast, the guests gathered by the pier. A small boat, painted coral red and named Serafina, bobbed on the water. The air buzzed with chatter. Evelyn and Daniel found seats near the bow. The captain, a sun-brown man with a sailor's grin, untied the ropes, and the boat began to glide. The ride was smooth, the sea calm and translucent. Flying fish darted beside them like living silver commas. Daniel raised his camera, but then lowered it again, watching instead. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "I think the best photographs are the ones we never take." Evelyn smiled. "Then you must have quite an album by now." He looked at her, half serious. "You have no idea." The island they approached was small and green, with a single white lighthouse rising like a sentinel. From a distance, Evelyn could see the railings rusted by salt and time. Something about the place felt familiar, not like a memory, but like déjà vu, a scene she'd dreamed before she'd ever lived it. They disembarked, barefoot on soft sand. May and the captain set up a table with parchment and bottles, inviting guests to write letters to the sea. Evelyn watched couples laugh, children scribble. A young man proposed to his girlfriend beside the water. Daniel wrote quickly, folded his page, and sealed it with wax. Evelyn just stared at her blank paper. The wind teased it, asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. "What do you write?" she murmured. "When you've already said goodbye?" Daniel tilted his head. "Maybe you write hello." It was such a simple answer it stopped her. She looked at the page again, then uncapped her pen. The words came slowly, but they came. "Dear Harold." You told me once that the sea was just a mirror for everything we've lost. I think you were wrong. It's also a window. I've met someone who reminds me that light can bend and still be beautiful. Don't worry, I'm not replacing you. I'm just remembering how to be me. She signed it Evie. For the first time in years, the name didn't feel like an echo. May handed her a small bottle. Put it inside, she said. And when you're ready, give it to the tide. Evelyn corked the bottle, her hands trembling slightly. She and Daniel walked together to the shoreline. The water lapped at their ankles, cool and insistent. She held the bottle a moment longer, then let it go. It floated, spun once, and began to drift out to sea. They stood in silence until it disappeared from sight. That, Daniel said softly, was one of the bravest things I've ever seen. Evelyn laughed, embarrassed. It was just a bottle. No, he said, turning toward her. It was the past. And you let it go. Something passed between them then. Something wordless but alive, like the shimmer on the edge of a wave. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn didn't feel like a widow or a traveler, or someone who was running out of time. She just felt present. Later, while the group shared lunch under the lighthouse, May approached again. Miss Evelyn, she whispered. Would you like to see something? It's about Evie's promise. Intrigued, Evelyn followed her up the spiral stairs of the lighthouse. The walls were rough, etched with initials and years of salt. At the top, May pointed to a weathered box tucked behind an old oil drum. This was found 10 years ago, May said. It washed up after a storm. Inside, letters. Old ones, faded. All signed Evie. But one was different. One wasn't addressed to anyone at all. Evelyn hesitated, heart thudding. May lifted the lid and pulled out a single envelope. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, eerily like Harold's. On the front, for the woman who still listens to the sea. Her breath caught. She opened it carefully. Inside was a small, yellowed sheet of paper. The ink had bled, but the words were still legible. If you find this, it means you came back. Maybe not here, but somewhere. I always hoped you would. Don't be afraid to love again. The world is wide, and you are still in it. She stared at the note until the letters blurred. Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs, slightly out of breath. Evelyn? Everything okay? She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it slowly, then looked up at her. Is that? I don't know, she whispered. It can't be. And yet. The wind swirled through the lighthouse, lifting strands of her hair like fingers. She felt dizzy, suspended between disbelief and wonder. Daniel reached out, gently steadying her elbow. Maybe it doesn't matter who wrote it. Maybe it's what you needed to hear. She looked at him then, really looked. At the kindness in his face, the earnestness that had no agenda. At how he was not trying to replace anything, only to share space in her story. Maybe, she said softly, maybe that's what the sea does. It returns what we're ready for. They descended the stairs together, the sound of their footsteps echoing like a soft refrain. That evening, back at the resort, there was a dinner under lanterns. Music drifted across the sand again, that same Sinatra song from their first night. Daniel asked her to dance. This time she didn't hesitate. The stars blinked above them, the tide whispered below. She leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. For a moment, she could almost hear Harold laughing somewhere, saying, Finally, Evie. You found the map. When the song ended, Daniel didn't let go right away. You know, he murmured. I think the sea meant for us to meet. Evelyn smiled. Then I suppose I should thank it. He looked at her, eyes bright. You just did. Later that night, alone on her veranda, she opened the locket. Inside was the tiny photo of her and Harold on their honeymoon. Young, sunburned, unafraid. She took the Polaroid Daniel had given her, and slid it behind the old one, layering the two lives together. Past and present, side by side. The sea was calm again, but alive with moonlight. Somewhere out there, her letter floated, carried by currents she would never trace. She imagined it finding another shore, another pair of eyes, maybe another woman learning how to say hello again. For the first time since Harold's passing, Evelyn whispered into the night. "Thank you." The waves answered in their ancient language. And for once, she understood. The days that followed felt like chapters Evelyn hadn't realized she still had left to read. The island seemed to know her now. It sighed in the mornings when she opened her door, shimmered in the afternoons when she walked along the shore, and hushed at night when she whispered good night to the sea. Daniel became part of the rhythm. They ate breakfast together, always at the same table under the palms. He'd tease her for choosing tea over coffee. She'd tease him for never remembering sunscreen. They'd talk about everything and nothing. Books, travel, small absurdities of life. The kind of conversations that don't try to impress, only connect. But beneath the lightness, something deeper moved. Quiet, like a current beneath calm water. Evelyn felt it whenever Daniel smiled at her too long, or when his hand brushed hers accidentally and lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. One afternoon, as the sun leaned westward and the resort settled into its lazy rhythm, Daniel appeared at her villa carrying 2 snorkeling masks and a grin that said, "Don't argue, just come." "Another adventure?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Something like that. There's a sandbar that appears when the tide's low. Locals call it the vanishing path. You can walk across it for about an hour before it disappears again." She hesitated. "And you thought I'd be perfect company for an adventure with an expiration date?" He laughed. "Exactly. Come on. Before it vanishes." They took a small boat out to the edge of the reef. The water shimmered so bright it looked like the sky had melted. The sandbar appeared like a secret, a pale ribbon stretching between 2 shades of blue. They stepped out, barefoot. The sand was soft, warm from the sun. Around them, nothing but ocean. Evelyn felt small, but also infinite, like the world had opened itself just to see what she'd do with the moment. Daniel walked a few steps ahead, turning to face her. "You know," he said, "you surprise me." "Why's that?" "Most people come here to forget something. You came to remember." Evelyn stopped. The wind toyed with her white linen scarf. "Maybe that's all the same thing," she said. "Sometimes remembering is how we finally forget." He nodded, studying her face the way he studied light through his camera lens, careful, reverent. Then he said something that turned the air between them electric. "What if you didn't have to do it alone?" For a moment, she couldn't answer. The sea was whispering, the sun was burning gold paths across the waves, and everything inside her wanted to retreat to safety. She was 72. He was 35. The math was absurd. The idea, impossible. And yet, there was no mockery in his tone, no pity. Only honesty. "Daniel," she began softly, "whatever this is, it's beautiful. But you have so much ahead of you." He shook his head. "And you think you don't?" The simplicity of it broke something open in her. For years, she had measured her life in what was after. After Harold. After loss. After purpose. But standing there with the ocean folding around her ankles and the horizon turning molten, she realized that after was still life. She took a step closer. "You're a stubborn man, Daniel." He smiled. "Only when it matters." They stood in silence, the waves curling at their feet. Then Daniel reached out and took her hand. Not to claim, but to steady. "Let's make a deal," he said. "We don't name this. We don't label it or try to explain it to anyone. We just let it be what it is. 2 souls who met when the tide was kind." Evelyn let out a soft laugh that caught somewhere between relief and wonder. "A deal, then." They walked the rest of the sandbar hand in hand until the tide began to rise, erasing their footprints as quickly as they made them. That evening, back at the resort, a note waited on Evelyn's veranda. It wasn't from Daniel or the staff. The handwriting was old-fashioned, looping. It simply said, "Evie, the sea doesn't keep secrets forever. Come to the dock at sunrise. Bring the locket." She read it 3 times. Her hands trembled slightly, the same way they had the first time she read Harold's letters 50 years ago. When dawn came, she went. The sky was brushed with pink and lavender, the sea still half asleep. Daniel was already there, camera slung over his shoulder. "Couldn't sleep," he said quietly. "Something told me you'd be here." Evelyn handed him the note. "I don't know who wrote it." He read it, brow furrowing. "Maybe May?" "Maybe." They stood together as the first line of sunlight broke across the water. That's when Evelyn saw it, something small floating toward the dock. A glass bottle, rocking gently with the waves. Her heart kicked. Daniel crouched, reaching with a net, and pulled it in. Inside was a rolled piece of paper tied with twine. He handed it to her wordlessly. Evelyn's fingers shook as she opened it. The parchment was old, damp, but still legible. "My dearest Evie. If this reaches you, it means I've kept my promise. I said I'd find a way to send you one more map. So here it is. Stop searching for me in the past. Look around you. The world still needs your kindness, your stories, your laughter. Someone will come along who reminds you that love isn't a single lifetime. It's a language we just keep learning. H." She read it aloud, barely breathing. The H was familiar. Harold always signed his notes that way. Tears blurred the sunrise. She laughed and cried all at once. "He always did have terrible timing," she said, voice trembling. Daniel stood close, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Looks like he kept his word." Evelyn nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting through the tears. "He'd love this, me weeping on a dock at 6 in the morning while some handsome man watches." Daniel smiled softly. "Then let's make it worth his effort." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, the Polaroid she'd tucked into her locket. Except now, written on the back in his handwriting, were the words, "New map begins here." She stared at it, then at him. "You're impossible. I've been called worse." She slipped the Polaroid back into the locket, beside Harold's picture. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sun rose higher, painting the sea in fire and gold. Finally, Evelyn turned to Daniel. "Do you believe in signs?" He grinned. "After this week? I believe in everything." She laughed, a real, full laugh that startled even herself. "Then let's stop waiting for tides. Let's live while the water's warm." Daniel offered his hand. "Deal?" "Deal." They walked back toward the villas, the morning bright around them. That evening, the resort hosted its final bonfire before Evelyn's departure. Guests gathered in a circle, faces glowing orange in the firelight. Someone played guitar, and May sang in a soft, lilting voice about the sea carrying home what the heart leaves behind. When the music paused, Evelyn stood. "May I say something?" The circle quieted. She took a breath. "I came here because I thought my story had ended. But it turns out, endings are just beginnings we haven't recognized yet. The sea taught me that. And so did someone who made me laugh again." She looked toward Daniel. His eyes met hers, steady, shining. "I think," she said, "we all deserve to surprise ourselves, no matter how old we are." Applause rose like surf. Even May wiped her eyes discreetly. Later, when the bonfire dimmed and the stars claimed the sky, Daniel and Evelyn walked along the beach. "You know," he said, "you could stay longer. I mean, who says you have to leave?" Evelyn looked out at the horizon. "Every map has to lead somewhere new. But maybe this time, I won't go alone." Daniel smiled. "Then wherever you go next, I'll meet you there." They stopped walking. The tide kissed their feet. The world felt wide open, like a story refusing to end. Evelyn turned to him, the moonlight painting her hair silver. "Do you know what Harold used to say about love?" "What?" "That it's not about finding someone new. It's about finding new ways to love, again and again." Daniel reached for her hand, and she let him. The ocean murmured approval, as if it too had been waiting for this. Above them, the stars began to pulse brighter, and for a brief, impossible moment, Evelyn swore she saw a shape in the water, a shimmer like a man waving from the waves before fading into light. She smiled through her tears. "Good night, Harold," she whispered. Then she looked at Daniel, her voice clear and strong. "Hello tomorrow." The sea breathed. The night listened. And the story, hers, his, theirs, kept unfolding, endlessly, beautifully, like the tide.